The stagecoach rumbled into Colfax, California on a scorching July afternoon in 1878, and Sara Vance stepped down onto the dusty main street with nothing but a worn carpetbag, a faded photograph of her deceased mother, and the bitter knowledge that every door in Sacramento had closed in her face. She had come to this mountain town, nestled in the Sierra Nevada foothills, because her aunt had left her a small boarding house in her will, a final gift from a woman Sara had met only twice in her childhood. The building stood at the edge of town, its paint peeling and shutters hanging crooked, but it was hers, and that meant everything to a woman who had spent the last 3 years watching her family's respectability crumble after her father's gambling debts destroyed their name. Sara was 22 years old, with auburn hair that caught the sunlight like copper wire and green eyes that held more determination than most men twice her age. She wore a simple gray traveling dress that had seen better days, and she carried herself with a straight spine despite the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her shoulders. The journey from Sacramento had taken 2 days, and she had spent most of it listening to the other passengers whisper about her when they thought she could not hear. A woman traveling alone was enough to spark gossip, but a woman traveling alone to run a boarding house was practically scandalous. The main street of Colfax stretched before her like a promise and a threat all at once. Buildings lined both sides of the wide dirt road, their false fronts painted in colors that the sun had bleached to pale shadows of their former glory. She could see a general store, a saloon with swinging doors that released bursts of piano music and laughter, a blacksmith's forge where sparks flew like fireflies, and a handful of other establishments that proclaimed the town's modest prosperity. Gold had been found in these hills 20 years earlier, and though the rush had faded, enough remained to keep Colfax alive and growing. Sara picked up her carpetbag and started walking toward the boarding house. She had gone perhaps 20 paces when she became aware of the attention. Men stopped what they were doing to watch her pass. A group of miners standing outside the saloon fell silent, their eyes tracking her movement with obvious interest. 2 ranchers tipped their hats but made no move to approach. A merchant sweeping his storefront paused mid-stroke to stare. She felt their gazes like physical things, assessing and measuring, and she knew exactly what they were thinking. A new woman in town, young and unmarried, operating a boarding house alone. She would be the subject of speculation for weeks, but none of them approached. None of them spoke beyond polite nods. They looked, they wondered, and they kept their distance. Sara told herself it was proper, that it showed respect, but something in their careful avoidance made her feel more alone than ever. She was an outsider here, marked by her circumstances and her solitary state, and these men would treat her with the kind of distant courtesy reserved for women who existed outside the normal boundaries of society. The boarding house sat at the intersection of Main Street and Pine Road, a 2-story structure with a wraparound porch and rooms enough for 8 guests. Sara climbed the front steps and used the key the lawyer had sent her to open the door. The interior smelled of dust and disuse, and furniture sat shrouded beneath white sheets like ghosts waiting to be awakened. Her aunt had died 6 months earlier, and the place had stood empty ever since, accumulating cobwebs and silence. Sara set down her bag and moved through the rooms, pulling sheets away and opening windows to let in fresh air. The boarding house had good bones, she could see that much. The floors were solid oak, the walls plastered and painted in warm colors, and the kitchen at the back was larger than she had expected, with a cast iron stove that would need cleaning but appeared functional. Upstairs, she found the guest rooms neat and spare, each with a bed, a dresser, and a washstand. The room at the far end of the hall was larger, with a window that looked out over the pine-covered hills, and Sara claimed it as her own. She spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning, sweeping out dust and scrubbing surfaces until her hands were red and her back ached. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, she stood on the front porch and surveyed her new domain. This was hers. This place, this business, this chance to build something from nothing. The thought filled her with equal parts terror and exhilaration. The next morning, Sara opened the boarding house for business. She hung a sign on the front porch that advertised clean rooms and hot meals, and she walked to the general store to purchase supplies. The proprietor, a round-faced man named Mr. Henderson, greeted her with cautious friendliness and helped her select flour, sugar, coffee, and other essentials. He asked careful questions about her plans, and Sara answered with confidence she did not entirely feel. Yes, she intended to run the boarding house herself. No, she did not have family in town. Yes, she understood it would be hard work. Mr. Henderson nodded slowly at each response, his expression suggesting he gave her about a month before she gave up and left. Sara returned to the boarding house with her purchases and spent the day preparing. She baked bread, made stew, and ensured every room was spotless. By evening, she had her first customer, a traveling salesman who paid for a week in advance and complimented her cooking with genuine enthusiasm. It was a small victory, but it felt enormous. Days turned into weeks, and Sara fell into a rhythm. She woke before dawn to start breakfast, spent her mornings cleaning and doing laundry, and devoted her afternoons to whatever maintenance the old building required. Guests came and went, mostly miners and businessmen passing through town, and she treated each one with professional courtesy. The work was endless and exhausting, but it was hers, and that made all the difference. The men of Colfax continued to keep their distance. They nodded when she passed on the street, they patronized her business when they needed a room, but none of them truly approached her. Sara understood why. She was a respectable woman running a respectable business, and they would not risk her reputation or their own by showing improper interest. The married men avoided her to prevent gossip, and the unmarried men seemed to view her as untouchable, a woman too independent and too complicated for casual courtship. There were moments when the loneliness threatened to overwhelm her. She would stand on her porch in the evening, watching families walk past on their way home from church or the general store, and feel the ache of isolation settle deep in her chest. She had chosen this life, this independence, but the choosing did not make it any less difficult. August arrived with heat that baked the town and turned the surrounding hills golden brown. Sara's boarding house was doing well enough to pay its expenses and put a little aside, but the work never ceased. She was scrubbing the front steps one afternoon, her sleeves rolled up and her hair escaping its pins, when she heard the sound of a horse approaching at an easy walk. She looked up to see a man riding down Main Street, and something about him made her pause with her brush still in hand. He sat his horse with the relaxed confidence of someone who had spent his entire life in the saddle, his body moving in perfect rhythm with the animal beneath him. He wore dusty trail clothes, dark pants and a worn cotton shirt, with a leather vest and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. A gun belt rode low on his hips, and saddlebags bulged behind him. He looked like he had ridden a long way. Sara watched as the man guided his horse down the street. Other people noticed him too. She saw Mr. Henderson step out of his store to look, and several men outside the saloon turned to observe the newcomer's passage. There was something about him that commanded attention, though Sara could not immediately identify what it was. Perhaps it was the way he carried himself, with a quiet self-assurance that needed no declaration. Or perhaps it was simply that he was a stranger, and strangers were always noteworthy in a town like Colfax. The rider continued down the street, passing the saloon, the blacksmith, the various shops and businesses. He was heading toward the far end of town, toward the boarding house, and Sara felt her heartbeat quicken, though she could not have said why. She told herself not to be foolish, that he was probably just riding through, but she could not shake the strange feeling that had settled over her. Men stood on the boardwalk and watched him pass. She saw Tom Brennan, who owned the largest ranch in the area, study the stranger with narrowed eyes. She saw the Calloway brothers, both prosperous merchants, exchange glances as the rider went by. Others watched too, dozens of men observing the newcomer's progress with varying degrees of interest and curiosity. But the stranger did not stop to greet any of them. He did not even slow his pace. He kept riding, his gaze fixed ahead, until he reached the boarding house. Then he reined in his horse and dismounted with fluid grace, his boots hitting the dusty ground without a sound. Sara stood frozen on the steps, her cleaning forgotten. The man tied his horse to the hitching post and turned to face her. For the first time, she could see his face clearly beneath the brim of his hat. He was young, perhaps 25 or 26, with strong features that spoke of Spanish heritage mixed with something else, Anglo or Irish perhaps. His skin was tanned dark by sun and wind, his hair black and slightly too long, and his eyes were a startling shade of gray that seemed to look right through her. He was handsome in a rough, weathered way that had nothing to do with polish or refinement, and everything to do with the raw strength of a man who had lived hard and survived. He walked up the path toward her, his spurs jingling softly with each step, and Sara found herself straightening, her hand tightening on the brush she still held. He climbed the porch steps and stopped an arm's length away from her, close enough that she could see the dust on his clothes and the faint scar that ran along his left jawline. Then he spoke, and his voice was low and rough, with an accent that suggested the border country of Texas or New Mexico. "I came for you," he said. Sara stared at him, her mind struggling to process the words. They made no sense. She had never seen this man before in her life. She had no idea who he was or where he had come from. And yet he stood before her, dusty and trail-worn and utterly certain, claiming he had come for her specifically. "I beg your pardon," she managed to say, her voice coming out steadier than she felt. The man's gray eyes never wavered. "My name is Xander Fallon. I have been riding for 3 weeks to get here. I came for you, Sara Vance." The sound of her name in his mouth sent a shock through her system. "How do you know my name?" "Your aunt, Margaret Vance, was a friend of my mother's," Xander said. "Before she died, she wrote to my mother. She was worried about you, about what would happen when you came here alone. She asked my mother to send word to me to ask if I might come to Colfax and make sure you were all right." Sara's grip on the brush tightened until her knuckles went white. "My aunt asked you to come check on me." "That makes no sense. She barely knew me. We met twice when I was a child." "She knew your mother well," Xander said quietly. "And she knew what happened to your family in Sacramento. She wanted to help you, but she was dying, and there was not much she could do except leave you this place. But she worried it would not be enough, so she reached out." Sara felt something twist in her chest, part anger and part grief. "I do not need someone to check on me. I am managing perfectly well on my own." "I can see that," Xander said, and there was something in his tone that was not quite agreement but not quite contradiction either. "But I gave my word I would come, and I am a man who keeps his word." They stood facing each other on the porch, and Sara became acutely aware that people were watching. She could feel eyes on them from all directions, The curious and speculative gazes of townspeople who had just witnessed a strange man ride straight to her door and announce he had come for her. The gossip would spread like wildfire. She could already imagine the whispered conversations, the raised eyebrows, the assumptions. "You should not have come," she said, keeping her voice low. "Whatever my aunt asked of you, whatever promise you made, it was not necessary." "I do not need your help, Mr. Fallon." "Maybe not," Xander said, "but I am here now. And since I rode 3 weeks to get here, I would appreciate a room and a meal." Sara opened her mouth to refuse, to tell him to take his horse and ride to one of the other boarding houses in town, but she stopped herself. She was running a business, and turning away a paying customer out of pride or stubbornness would be foolish. Besides, he had ridden 3 weeks because her aunt had asked him to. Whatever his reasons, whatever strange sense of duty had brought him here, he deserved basic hospitality. "Fine," she said curtly. "I have a room available, $5 a week, meals included. Fair enough." Xander reached into his pocket and produced a small leather purse, from which he counted out the money and handed it to her. His fingers brushed hers in the exchange, rough and warm, and Sara pulled her hand back quickly. "The room is upstairs, second door on the left," she said. "Supper is at 6 o'clock. Xander nodded and touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was more respectful than mocking. Then he turned and went to his horse to retrieve his saddlebags. Sara watched him for a moment before retreating inside, her heart pounding harder than it should have been. She busied herself in the kitchen, trying not to think about the stranger upstairs or the way his gray eyes had looked at her with such certainty. "I came for you." The words echoed in her mind, strange and unsettling. What did he mean by that? Surely just that he had come to check on her, as her aunt had requested. But the way he had said it, with such finality and conviction, had sounded like something else entirely. Sara had 3 other guests at the moment: the traveling salesman, a young mining engineer, and an older gentleman who was visiting his son's family. All 4 men gathered in the dining room at 6 o'clock, and Sara served supper with her usual efficiency. She had made roasted chicken with potatoes and carrots, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert. The food was good and plentiful, and the men ate with obvious appreciation. Xander sat at the far end of the table, quiet and observant. He did not dominate the conversation the way some men did, but when he spoke, the others listened. Sara learned that he was a rancher from New Mexico territory, that he raised cattle and horses on land his family had owned for generations, and that he had left his younger brother in charge while he made this journey to California. He spoke little of himself beyond those basic facts, deflecting personal questions with polite skill. After supper, the guests retired to the parlor while Sara cleaned up. She was washing dishes when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Xander standing in the kitchen doorway. "Can I help?" he asked. "No, thank you, I can manage." "I am sure you can," Xander said. "But my mother would skin me alive if she knew I sat idle while a woman did all the work. Let me dry." Before Sara could protest further, he had picked up a dish towel and positioned himself beside her. They worked in silence for several minutes, Sara washing and Xander drying, and despite her determination to remain distant, she found herself hyper-aware of his presence. He was tall, she realized, at least 6 feet, and broad through the shoulders in a way that spoke of hard physical labor. He moved with economy and precision, no wasted motion, and his hands were steady and sure as he dried each plate and stacked it on the counter. "Why did you really come?" Sara asked finally, unable to contain the question any longer. Xander was quiet for a moment, focusing on the plate in his hands. "I told you. Your aunt asked my mother to send word to me." "That is not a complete answer. He glanced at her and something flickered in his gray eyes. "No, I suppose it is not." He set down the plate and turned to face her fully. "The truth is, when my mother told me about you, about what your aunt had written, I felt compelled to come. I cannot explain it better than that. It was just something I knew I had to do." Sara frowned. "That makes even less sense." "I know." Xander smiled slightly, and the expression transformed his face, softening the hard edges and making him look younger. "But here I am anyway." Sara turned back to the dishes, trying to hide her confusion. There was something about this man that unsettled her, that made her feel off balance in a way she could not explain. He was too direct, too certain, and too comfortable in her space. Most men kept a careful distance, but Xander Fallon seemed to have no such compunctions. Over the next few days, Xander became a fixture at the boarding house. He paid for a second week, then a third, showing no signs of leaving. He helped with tasks around the property without being asked, repairing the loose shutter that had been driving Sara mad for weeks, fixing a broken step on the back porch, and even replacing several rotted boards on the roof. When Sara protested that she had not asked for his help, he simply shrugged and said he needed something to do. The town noticed. Of course they noticed. Colfax was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, and the arrival of a mysterious stranger who had ridden straight to Sara Vance's boarding house and apparently settled in for an extended stay was prime gossip material. Sara felt the weight of their attention every time she walked down the street. She saw the speculation in Mrs. Henderson's eyes when she shopped at the general store, heard the whispers that fell silent when she entered the post office, and caught the meaningful looks exchanged by the women at church on Sunday. She tried to ignore it, tried to tell herself that their opinions did not matter, but it wore on her. She had worked so hard to establish herself as respectable, to prove that she could run her business properly and maintain her reputation. Now this man had appeared and thrown everything into question. "People are talking," she told Xander one evening as they sat on the front porch after supper. The other guests had gone out for the evening, and the two of them were alone in the gathering dusk. "Let them talk," Xander said from where he sat on the porch railing, one leg bent and the other dangling. "Words cannot hurt you unless you let them. Easy for you to say, you are a man. Your reputation is not in danger." Xander looked at her steadily. "Your reputation is solid because you have done nothing wrong. You are running an honest business and treating your guests with respect. The fact that I am staying here as a paying customer is nobody's concern but yours and mine. You know it is not that simple." "No, I suppose it is not." Xander was quiet for a moment, then said, "Do you want me to leave?" Sara opened her mouth to say yes, that would be best, but the word stuck in her throat. The truth was, she did not want him to leave. Despite the gossip and the complications, despite her determination to maintain her independence, she had grown accustomed to his presence. He made her feel less alone. When he was near, the boarding house felt less like a prison of endless work and more like a home. "No," she said finally, the admission costing her something. "I do not want you to leave." Xander's expression softened. "Then I will stay." As summer faded into autumn, Sara found herself spending more and more time with Xander. They talked in the evenings after the work was done, sharing stories of their pasts and their dreams for the future. Sara learned that Xander's family had come to New Mexico territory 3 generations ago, that his grandfather had built their ranch from nothing, and that his mother was a fierce, determined woman who had raised 4 sons mostly on her own after Xander's father died when Xander was 12. Xander spoke of his land with obvious love, describing the way the light looked on the desert mesas at dawn, and the satisfaction of working with horses that trusted him. In turn, Sara told him about Sacramento, about the slow disintegration of her family standing after her father's gambling became public knowledge. She told him about the creditors who had taken everything, about the way former friends had turned away, and about her mother's death 2 years ago from what the doctor called a broken heart, but Sara knew was really shame and exhaustion. She had never spoken of these things to anyone in Colfax, had kept them locked tight inside, but with Xander, the words came easily. He listened without judgment, his gray eyes steady and understanding, and when she finished, he said simply, "You have been brave. Coming here alone, building this business, refusing to give up, that takes courage." Sara felt something crack open inside her chest, some hard protective shell she had built around her heart. "I did not have a choice. We always have choices," Xander said. "You could have married some man who offered security, even if you did not love him. You could have taken a job as a seamstress or a shop girl and lived in a boarding house yourself. You could have given up and gone back to Sacramento, regardless of the shame, but you did not. You came here and fought for your independence. That was a choice, and it was brave." Sara looked away, blinking against the sudden sting of tears. Nobody had ever said such things to her before. Nobody had ever acknowledged what it had cost her to come here, to stand alone, to keep moving forward even when everything in her wanted to collapse. "Thank you," she whispered. Xander reached across the space between them and took her hand. His palm was warm and rough against hers, and Sara felt the contact like an electric shock. She should have pulled away, should have reminded him that such familiarity was inappropriate, but she could not make herself do it. Instead, she held on, drawing strength from the simple human connection. They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped in the darkness, while the night sounds of Colfax surrounded them. It was the first time Sara had allowed herself to lean on anyone since her mother's death, and it terrified her. But it also felt right in a way she could not deny. October brought cooler weather and brilliant autumn colors to the hills around Colfax. The miners began preparing for winter, and the boarding house stayed busy with men coming and going. Sara's business was thriving, and she had even managed to save a decent sum of money. By any measure, she was succeeding. But success felt hollow when she went to bed alone each night, when she woke to face another day of endless work with no one to share it. She had spent so long telling herself that independence was enough, that she did not need anyone, but Xander's presence had revealed that for the lie it was. She wanted more. She wanted companionship and partnership. She wanted someone to build a life with. And she wanted that someone to be Xander Fallon. The realization hit her one morning as she watched him working in the back garden, harvesting the last of the vegetables before the first frost. He moved with practiced efficiency, his strong hands gentle with the plants, and Sara felt her heart turn over in her chest. She loved him. She had fallen in love with this quiet, steady man who had ridden 3 weeks to check on a stranger because he had given his word. The knowledge terrified her. Love meant vulnerability. It meant trusting someone enough to let them into the deepest parts of yourself, and trust had been in short supply in Sara's life. But as she watched Xander straighten up and wipe his brow, as she saw the small smile that curved his lips when he noticed her watching, she knew there was no going back. She loved him, and she would have to figure out what to do about it. That evening, after supper was finished and the other guests had retired, Sara found Xander sitting on the porch steps, looking out at the darkening street. She sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "You have been here almost 3 months," she said. "I have." "How much longer do you plan to stay?" Xander turned to look at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "That depends." "On what?" "On you." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. "I do not understand." Xander shifted to face her more fully. "Sarah, I did not come here just because your aunt asked my mother to send word to me. I mean, that is how it started, but it became something else. When my mother told me about you, about what you were trying to do, I felt drawn to you in a way I cannot explain. I wanted to meet you. I wanted to know you. And then I got here and saw you scrubbing those steps with your hair falling down and determination written all over your face, and I knew. Knew what? That I had found what I had been looking for all my life." Xander reached up and cupped her face with one hand, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "I love you, Sara Vance. I have loved you since the moment I laid eyes on you, and I will stay here forever if you want me to, or I will leave tomorrow if that is what you need. But I had to tell you the truth." Sara could not breathe, could not think. His words washed over her like a wave, overwhelming and terrifying and wonderful all at once. "You love me, with everything I am. But we have only known each other 3 months. How can you be so sure?" Xander smiled, that rare, beautiful smile that transformed his face. "Some things you just know. The moment I saw you, I knew you were meant to be mine. And I was meant to be yours. Call it fate or destiny or whatever you like, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life." Sara felt tears spill down her cheeks. "I love you too. I tried not to, tried to tell myself it was foolish and impossible, but I love you so much it scares me." "Do not be scared," Xander said softly. "I am not going anywhere. Whatever you need, whatever you want, I will give you. If you want to stay here and run this boarding house, we will make it work. If you want to come with me to New Mexico, I will take you home. All I ask is that you let me love you." Sara launched herself into his arms, and Xander caught her easily, holding her tight against his chest. She buried her face in his neck and let herself cry, releasing years of pent-up fear and loneliness and grief. He held her through it all, one hand stroking her back in soothing circles, murmuring soft words of comfort in a mixture of English and Spanish. When the storm passed and Sara pulled back to look at him, Xander was still smiling. He used his thumbs to wipe away her tears, then leaned forward and kissed her forehead with infinite tenderness. "Will you marry me?" he asked. "Yes," Sara said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." Xander's smile widened into a grin, and he kissed her properly then, his lips warm and sure against hers. Sara had been kissed before, fumbling attempts by boys in Sacramento who had no idea what they were doing, but this was different. This was a man who knew exactly what he wanted and was not afraid to claim it. She melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt, and kissed him back with all the emotion she had been holding in check. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Xander rested his forehead against hers. "We should probably make this official." Sara laughed breathlessly. "Probably." They went to see the minister the next morning. Reverend Thompson was a kind man in his 50s who had always treated Sara with respect, and he listened as Xander explained their situation and their desire to be married as soon as possible. The Reverend's eyes twinkled with amusement and approval as he agreed to perform the ceremony the following Sunday. News of the engagement spread through Colfax like wildfire. Sara had expected disapproval or scandal, but instead, she found mostly warmth and congratulations. It seemed the town had been waiting for something like this to happen, and now that it had, people were genuinely happy for her. Mrs. Henderson cornered Sara at the general store and insisted on helping her make a wedding dress, enlisting several other women to assist. The traveling salesman, who had become something of a permanent fixture at the boarding house, declared he would not miss the wedding for anything and promised to stand as a witness. The week before the wedding passed in a blur of activity. Sara and Xander discussed their future plans late into the night. They decided that Sara would keep the boarding house but hire someone to manage it so she could travel to New Mexico with Xander and see his ranch. If she loved it there, they would split their time between Colfax and New Mexico. If not, they would stay in California permanently. The important thing was that they would be together. Xander wrote to his brother to share the news, and Sara found herself both excited and nervous about meeting his family. She had spent so long alone that the idea of joining a large, boisterous clan was overwhelming. But Xander assured her they would love her as much as he did. Sunday arrived clear and bright, the October air crisp with the promise of winter. Sara dressed in the simple but lovely gown the women of Colfax had made for her, a cream-colored creation with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Mrs. Henderson helped her arrange her hair, pinning it up with small white flowers they had gathered from the last blooms in various gardens. The church was packed when Sara arrived. It seemed the entire town had turned out to witness the wedding, filling the pews and spilling out into the yard. Sara felt a rush of gratitude for these people who had welcomed her, who had given her a chance to prove herself, and who now celebrated her happiness. Xander stood at the altar, dressed in black trousers and a crisp white shirt, his dark hair combed back and his gray eyes locked on Sara from the moment she stepped through the church door. He looked devastating and perfect, and Sara felt her heart swell with love so powerful it nearly brought her to her knees. She walked down the aisle alone, as she had done everything else in her life, but this time it felt different. This time she was walking toward someone, toward a future built on love and partnership. When she reached the altar, Xander held out his hand, and Sara took it without hesitation. Reverend Thompson performed the ceremony with warmth and joy, his words about love and commitment resonating through the small church. Sara and Xander spoke their vows clearly, promising to honor and cherish each other through whatever life brought. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Xander pulled Sara into his arms and kissed her thoroughly, to the delighted applause and cheers of the assembled crowd. The celebration afterward was held at the boarding house, with food and drink provided by seemingly half the town. People laughed and danced and toasted the newlyweds, and Sara felt surrounded by warmth and acceptance in a way she had never experienced before. These people had become her community, her home, and she realized that coming to Colfax had been the best decision of her life. As the sun set and the party continued, Xander pulled Sara aside and led her away from the crowd. They walked to the edge of town, where they could see the pine-covered hills stretching away into the distance, dark shapes against the fading light. "Are you happy?" Xander asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind and pulling her back against his chest. Sara leaned into him, savoring his warmth and strength. "More than I ever thought possible." "Good." Xander pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Because I intend to spend the rest of my life making you even happier." Sara turned in his arms to face him. "I love you, Xander Fallon. Thank you for coming for me." "I will always come for you," Xander said seriously. "No matter where you are, no matter what happens, I will always find you." "That is my promise." They sealed the promise with a kiss as the stars began to appear overhead, tiny points of light in the vast darkness. Sara had spent so long feeling lost and alone, but now she was found. She had a home, a business, a community, and most importantly, she had a man who loved her with his whole heart. The first year of their marriage was an adventure. True to their plan, Sara hired a capable woman named Mrs. Donnelly to manage the boarding house, a widow in her 40s who had been looking for steady work and jumped at the opportunity. With the business in good hands, Sara traveled with Xander to New Mexico territory. The journey took 2 weeks, covering hundreds of miles through changing landscapes. They traveled by train part of the way, then by stagecoach, and finally on horseback for the last stretch. Sara had never seen country like this, vast and empty and beautiful in its harshness. The mesas rose like ancient monuments, their red and orange stone glowing in the sunlight, and the sky stretched overhead in a blue dome so wide it made her dizzy. Xander's ranch sat in a valley between two mesas, with a spring-fed stream running through the property and grass enough to support several hundred head of cattle. The main house was adobe, its thick walls painted white, with a red tile roof and a wide porch that wrapped around three sides. It was smaller than Sara had expected but well built and comfortable, with furniture that showed the wear of long use and the love of the family who had made it. Xander's mother, Valentina, greeted them with fierce hugs and rapid-fire Spanish that Xander had to translate. She was a tiny woman, barely 5 feet tall, with black hair streaked with silver and dark eyes that saw everything. She looked Sara up and down with an assessing gaze, then broke into a wide smile and declared in accented English that Sara was perfect and Xander had chosen well. Xander's brothers were harder to win over. Miguel, the oldest after Xander, was 24 and suspicious of the woman who had stolen his brother away. Rafael, who was 22, was more welcoming but reserved. And Carlos, the youngest at 19, was openly curious and bombarded Sara with questions until Valentina swatted him and told him to give the poor girl some peace. Sara spent the first few weeks feeling overwhelmed and out of place. The ranch operated on rhythms she did not understand, and everyone seemed to know what needed doing without discussion. She tried to help but felt clumsy and useless, her boarding house skills translating poorly to ranch work. Xander noticed her struggle, and one evening took her out to watch the sunset from the top of the nearest mesa. They sat side by side on the warm stone, looking out over the valley, and he asked her what was wrong. "I do not fit here," Sara admitted. "Your family is wonderful, but I feel like an outsider. I do not know how to do anything useful, and I am just in the way." Xander took her hand and laced their fingers together. "You are not in the way. You are learning. Nobody expects you to know how to run a ranch when you grew up in a city. Give yourself time. Your brothers do not like me. Miguel is protective and takes a while to warm up to new people. Rafael likes you fine, he is just quiet. And Carlos adores you even if he drives you crazy with questions. They will come around. You just have to be patient." Sara leaned her head on his shoulder. "I miss Colfax. I miss the boarding house and knowing what I am supposed to do. We can go back whenever you want. I told you that. This place is important to me, but you are more important. If you are unhappy here, we will leave." Sara was quiet for a long moment, thinking. She did miss Colfax, missed the familiarity and the independence of running her own business. But she also loved Xander, and this land was part of him. She could not ask him to give it up permanently, could not deny him the place that had shaped him. "No," she said finally. "I want to make this work. I want to learn. I just need time, like you said." Xander kissed her temple. "You are stronger than you think, Sara Fallon. You will figure it out." And slowly she did. Valentina took Sara under her wing and taught her the skills she needed. Sara learned to make tortillas and cook over an open fire, to tend the vegetable garden and preserve food for the winter, to mend clothes and manage the household. Valentina was a patient but demanding teacher, and Sara found herself rising to the challenge. Miguel warmed to her after she helped him deliver a difficult foal one night, staying up until dawn to ensure both the mare and baby survived. He saw her determination and her refusal to give up, and something in him softened. After that, he began including her in conversations and asking her opinion on ranch matters. Rafael remained quiet, but Sara noticed he started leaving small gifts for her, a particularly beautiful rock, wildflowers in a jar, a carved wooden bird. She understood that this was his way of welcoming her, and she treasured each offering. Carlos became her shadow, following her around and teaching her everything he knew about horses and cattle and the land. He had a gift for explaining things clearly, and Sara learned more from him in a month than she had from anyone else. By spring, Sara felt like part of the family. She had found her place on the ranch, contributing in ways that mattered, and she had grown to love the harsh beauty of the New Mexico landscape. But she still missed Colfax, missed the boarding house and the town that had given her a chance. She and Xander discussed it and decided they would split their time, spending spring and summer in New Mexico and fall and winter in California. It was not a perfect solution, but it allowed them to honor both of their commitments and build a life that incorporated both places. They returned to Colfax in October, just as the leaves were beginning to turn. The boarding house was thriving under Mrs. Donnelly's management, and the town welcomed them back with enthusiasm. Sara fell back into the rhythm of life there easily, and Xander found work helping at various ranches in the area, his skills always in demand. That winter, Sara discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with a mixture of joy and terror. She was 24 years old, married to a man she loved desperately, and about to become a mother. It felt surreal. Xander was overjoyed. He hovered over her constantly, worrying about every little thing, until Sara finally had to sit him down and explain that pregnancy was not an illness, and she was perfectly capable of continuing her normal activities. He relaxed somewhat after that, but never stopped being attentive and protective. Sara's pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter and into spring. In April, they traveled back to New Mexico so she could be near Valentina when the baby came. Sara was grateful for her mother-in-law's presence and experience as her due date approached. In early June, after 12 hours of labor that Xander spent pacing holes in the floor outside the bedroom, Sara gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Thomas, after Sara's father, who despite his flaws had loved her fiercely. Little Thomas had his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes, and from the moment Xander held him, Sara knew her husband was completely lost. Watching Xander with their son made Sara fall in love with him all over again. He was tender and patient, changing diapers and walking the floor at night when Thomas cried, singing Spanish lullabies his mother had sung to him. He built a cradle with his own hands and carved Thomas's name into the headboard with painstaking care. The first year of Thomas's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and overwhelming love. Sara had never known it was possible to love someone so much, to feel so fiercely protective and devoted. Motherhood changed her, softening some of her sharp edges while strengthening her core. They returned to Colfax when Thomas was 6 months old, and the town fell in love with the baby immediately. Mrs. Henderson knitted him blankets. Reverend Thompson blessed him at church, and Sara's regular boarders brought gifts and cooed over him like doting uncles. Life fell into a comfortable pattern. Sara and Xander split their time between New Mexico and California, raising Thomas in both places and building a life that honored their pasts while creating their future. The boarding house continued to thrive, and Xander's ranch prospered under his and Miguel's combined leadership. 2 years after Thomas's birth, Sara had a daughter they named Margaret, after her aunt who had made everything possible. Maggie, as they called her, had her mother's auburn hair and her father's gray eyes, and she was fierce and determined from the moment she drew breath. 2 years after that came another son, Daniel, who was quiet and thoughtful and seemed to observe everything with solemn attention. And 3 years later, their family was completed with the birth of another daughter, Alina, named after Xander's grandmother. Alina was all smiles and laughter, bringing joy wherever she went. Sara sometimes stood on the porch of the boarding house or the ranch house and looked at her life with wonder. She had gone from being alone and struggling to being surrounded by love and family. She had a husband who adored her, 4 healthy children, and homes in 2 places she loved. She had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams, not because she had done it alone, but because she had allowed herself to accept help and build something with someone else. Xander came up behind her on one such evening, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. The gesture was so familiar now, repeated hundreds of times over their years together, and Sara melted into him automatically. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his breath warm against her ear. "How lucky I am," Sara said. "How different my life might have been if you had not ridden into Colfax that day." "Not luck," Xander said. "Fate. You were always meant to be mine, and I was always meant to be yours. I knew it the moment I saw you." Sara turned in his arms to face him. There was gray in his hair now and lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun, but he was still the most handsome man she had ever seen. "I love you, Xander Fallon. Thank you for coming for me." "Always," Xander said, echoing the promise he had made on their wedding day. "I will always come for you." He kissed her then, deep and slow and full of the love they had built over years of partnership and devotion. Inside the house, Sara could hear their children playing, their laughter ringing out like music. This was her life, her family, her home. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and joys. Thomas grew into a serious young man who loved the ranch and showed a natural talent for working with horses. He spent most of his time in New Mexico, learning everything he could from Xander and his uncles. By the time he was 18, he was as skilled as any cowboy in the territory, and Xander knew the ranch would be in good hands when the time came to pass it on. Maggie was different. She inherited her mother's fierce independence and her father's determination, but she had no interest in ranching or housekeeping. She loved books and learning, and she announced at age 12 that she was going to be a teacher. Sara and Xander supported her dream, and when she was 16, they sent her to a teaching college in San Francisco. She returned 2 years later with her certificate and immediately took a position at the Colfax schoolhouse, where she taught with passion and skill that won her students' devotion. Daniel proved to have a gift for business. He loved numbers and organization, and he took naturally to managing the boarding house accounts and helping Sara plan for the future. He suggested expansions and improvements that increased their profits, and he negotiated deals with suppliers that saved them money. By the time he was 20, he was essentially running the boarding house business, freeing Sara to spend more time with her family. Alina, the baby, surprised everyone by falling in love with medicine. After helping the town doctor tend to an injured minor when she was 14, she became fascinated with healing. She apprenticed herself to the doctor and proved to be a quick study with steady hands and a calm demeanor. The doctor declared she had a natural talent and encouraged her to pursue formal medical training, a suggestion that sparked many long discussions in the Fallon household about propriety and possibility. Sara and Xander grew older together, their love deepening and maturing with each passing year. They had their disagreements, of course. Sara's stubborn independence sometimes clashed with Xander's protective instincts, and his tendency to make decisions without consulting her could spark arguments that lasted for days. But they always worked through their differences, always came back to the fundamental truth that they were stronger together than apart. Valentina passed away peacefully in her sleep when she was 72, surrounded by her sons and grandchildren. Her death hit Xander hard, but Sara held him through his grief, and he emerged from it with renewed appreciation for the time they had together, and the legacy Valentina had left. Miguel took over full management of the ranch, while Rafael and Carlos started their own spreads nearby, the three brothers forming a ranching alliance that made them one of the most prosperous families in the territory. When Sara turned 45, she made the decision to sell the boarding house to Mrs. Donnelly, who had been managing it for years and loved it as much as Sara ever had. The sale was bittersweet, but Sara knew it was time. Her children were grown, and she wanted to spend more time in New Mexico with Xander, to enjoy their ranch and watch their grandchildren grow up without the constant pull of obligations in California. But she never lost her connection to Colfax. The town remained special to her, the place where her life had truly begun, and she and Xander returned often to visit Maggie and Daniel and their growing families. Each time they rode into town, Sara remembered that hot July day when she had stepped off the stagecoach with nothing but a carpetbag and a prayer. She remembered how alone she had felt, how uncertain of her future. And she remembered the moment Xander Fallon had ridden into her life and changed everything. They were sitting on the porch of the ranch house one evening, watching the sunset paint the mesas in shades of gold and crimson, when Sara turned to Xander and asked, "Do you ever regret it? Coming to Colfax that day, giving up 3 weeks of your life to check on a stranger?" Xander looked at her with those steady gray eyes that still made her heart skip. "Regret finding the love of my life. Regret building this family and this life with you, not for a single second. Even though I was difficult and stubborn and fought you every step of the way." Xander laughed, the sound rich and warm. "Especially because of that. You would not be you if you were not difficult and stubborn. Those are some of the things I love most about you." Sara reached over and took his hand, their fingers intertwining automatically after years of practice. "I never thanked my aunt properly, never got the chance. She gave me everything, and I did not even know it until after she was gone." "She knew you would make the most of her gift," Xander said. "And you did. You built a successful business, made a home for yourself, and proved that you could stand on your own. The fact that you also found love and family along the way just made it even better." "Because you came for me," Sara said softly. "Because I came for you," Xander agreed. "And I would do it again. I would ride 3 weeks or 3 months or 3 years if that was what it took to find you. You are my heart, Sara Fallon. You always have been." They sat together in the gathering darkness, hands clasped and hearts full, while the stars began to appear overhead. Inside the house, they could hear Alina moving around the kitchen, preparing supper. She had decided against formal medical training, choosing instead to practice as a midwife and healer in the surrounding area, and she was currently staying with them while she built her reputation. Tomorrow, Thomas and his wife would arrive with their 2 children for a visit. Next week, Maggie was bringing her husband and 3 daughters to spend the summer. Daniel had written that he and his family would come in August. The house would be full of noise and laughter and love. 3 generations of Fallons gathered under one roof. Sara thought about that young woman who had arrived in Colfax 30 years ago, alone and afraid and determined to prove herself. That woman would be amazed to see what her life had become, to know the love and joy and fulfillment that waited for her. She would be stunned to learn that the stranger who rode into town and announced he had come for her would become her whole world. But Sara knew now what that younger version of herself could not have understood. Sometimes the greatest strength is not in standing alone, but in allowing someone to stand with you. Sometimes independence means having the courage to accept help, to build partnerships, to create something bigger than yourself. And sometimes love arrives on horseback, dusty and travel-worn and absolutely certain, speaking words that will change your life forever. I came for you. 3 simple words that held a universe of meaning, a promise that Xander had kept every single day of their marriage. He had come for her then, and he had never stopped coming for her, showing up in 1,000 small ways that demonstrated his love and commitment. He came for her when she was tired, taking over tasks so she could rest. He came for her when she was sad, holding her until the storm passed. He came for her when she was happy, celebrating her victories as if they were his own. He came for her when she was scared, standing between her and whatever threatened her peace. And she had come for him too, learning to be a partner instead of just an individual, to share burdens and joys, to build a life that was richer and fuller because it was shared. "What are you thinking about?" Xander asked, his voice breaking into her reverie. "Everything," Sara said. "Our life, our family, how grateful I am for every moment." "Me too," Xander said. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture he had performed countless times over the years but which still made her heart flutter. "I love you, Sara. Today, tomorrow, and forever." "Forever," Sara agreed, leaning her head on his shoulder. They sat together as the night deepened around them, 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful. The boarding house in Colfax still stood, now run by Mrs. Donnelly's daughter, a monument to Sara's courage and determination. The ranch spread out around them, prosperous and thriving, a testament to generations of hard work and love. And their family, scattered across 2 states but bound together by unbreakable ties, carried forward the legacy of 2 people who had dared to build a life together. In the distance, a coyote howled, its lonely cry echoing across the desert. But Sara did not feel lonely. She had never felt lonely, not since the day Xander Fallon had ridden into Colfax and spoken those fateful words. She had found her home, her partner, her purpose. She had found everything she never knew she needed. And it had all started with a cowboy who kept his promises, who had the courage to ride straight to her door and announce his intention, who had seen something in a struggling woman that nobody else had bothered to notice. Every man in town had passed her by that day, too cautious or too proper or too blind to see what stood right in front of them. But Xander had walked straight to her and claimed her with absolute certainty, changing both of their lives forever. It was the best thing that had ever happened to her. As the night settled fully over the ranch and the stars blazed overhead like diamonds scattered across black velvet, Sara felt a deep sense of contentment wash over her. This was her life, earned through struggle and sacrifice, and the courage to accept love when it was offered. This was her family, built through years of patience and compromise and devotion. This was her home, both the ranch in New Mexico and the town in California, 2 places that held pieces of her heart. And this was her husband, the man who had ridden into her life and refused to leave, who had shown her that strength and independence did not mean facing the world alone. He had taught her that true courage sometimes looked like accepting help, that real independence included the freedom to choose partnership, and that the greatest adventures were the ones you shared with someone you loved. Sara turned her head and kissed Xander's cheek, feeling his skin warm beneath her lips. "Thank you for being stubborn," she whispered. Xander chuckled. "Right back at you, love. Right back at you." They stayed on the porch long into the night, talking and laughing and simply being together. Inside the house, Alina finished her work and retired to bed. Around them, the ranch settled into sleep, horses in the barn, cattle in the distant pastures, and the land itself breathing slowly beneath the vast sky. And in the morning, they would wake and begin again, living the life they had built together, loving each other through whatever came. There would be more challenges, more joys, more years of shared experience that would deepen and enrich their bond. They would watch their children flourish and their grandchildren grow. They would weather storms and celebrate triumphs. They would hold each other through losses and raise glasses to victories. They would live fully and completely, two souls intertwined, two hearts beating as one. Because 30 years ago, a cowboy had ridden into Colfax, California, and spoken the truest words Sara Vance had ever heard. "I came for you." And he had been coming for her ever since, every single day, in every single way that mattered. That was the story of Sara and Xander Fallon. It was a story of courage and love, of independence and partnership, of two people who found each other when they needed it most and built something beautiful together. It was a story that began with a woman standing alone and ended with that same woman surrounded by family and love, having discovered that the greatest strength comes not from facing the world in solitude, but from choosing to walk through life hand in hand with someone who sees you, truly sees you, and loves what they find. It was, in the end, exactly the story it was always meant to be. A love story set against the backdrop of the Wild West, where a woman who had lost everything found more than she ever dreamed possible, and a man who had been searching all his life finally came home. They lived the rest of their years in happiness and contentment, growing old together with grace and gratitude. And when their story was finally complete, when they had lived fully and loved completely, they left behind a legacy of family and love that would endure for generations. Because some love stories are meant to last forever, and this was one of them,